like a lot of people, when I look at politics today, I think that we're living in the breakdown of the old order that's lasted since the Second World War, and that something new is happening. And it reminds me, well, it makes me think of a century ago when you had extreme left and extreme right movements evolving, and also in the context of a very kind of cold capitalism, and I mean, life turned into hell for millions of people. So it's scary stuff. We also don't know what tomorrow brings, and maybe this is just part of a disruptive moment that leads to something better. That can be true as well. So it's a funny thing, because we need to keep our eyes open and be serious. And I often, I talk about this stuff with people, and sometimes I offend friends who have a kind of a naive liberal view of life, because I think there are dangers that face us, and just as there always have been. There were a century ago, and you couldn't dismiss them a century ago, and you can't dismiss them now. But nonetheless, so we're all probably, if any of us who are paying attention, are probably going to be disturbed. I certainly get disturbed. But there's also a question about what view of the world and what sense of the future we want to adopt. And so we might get pulled in different ways, backwards and forwards, between something that's a bit more distressing or dark potentials, but also trying to move from that often enough into a sense of the future that's helpful and beneficial to us. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's one thing to be concerned about where things could go. Patterns are emerging. It's also a different matter to try and maybe adopt a kind of sense of the future of which you know nothing, of which none of us know anything, that helps you to make the present as good as possible. Here's one way of thinking about it. If the future does turn out okay, then don't you want to have made the present, which will be the past, as good as it could be for yourself? Life has always been dangerous. So are we always going to live in distress or terror or anxiety and live bad lives to that degree out of fear of what might be, when in fact the world's been getting, I think, better and better over the centuries? So that's one way of looking at it. Another one is, if it does go as bad as we fear and we starve to death, say, then okay, do we want to live a bad life in the meantime? Do we want to throw away these good years in fear of what might be? Let tomorrow take care of itself. This kind of distress and anxiety can be a bit like interest paid on future suffering. Interest that we pay now on future suffering that might not happen. Or if it does happen, why do you want to pay interest on it voluntarily? So here's two criteria that I use for developing any kind of perspective on life. And you might use this as criteria for how you think about the future. And as I say, you'll be pulled out of this perspective, but then you come back into it, if you like, a lot of us. And so these two criteria for me are, they're criteria that I always sort of suggest to people in counselling that they use to try and understand something insofar as their perspective is going to harm or hinder or benefit them. The two criteria are truth, because you can't get away from that. You can't voluntarily delude yourself. Certainly the majority of us in our really waking moments don't want to do that. One, truth. The other, is it beneficial? So the first question is, what possibilities or probabilities are there about the future? And maybe you can come up with 3 or 4. I can think of 3 or 4 right now. Some of them are terrible. Some of them are just fine. We lumber along as we've been doing and slowly improving. And some of them are great. Maybe things turn out much better than we anticipated, and all our technology and all the things that involve risks, because good, important things always involve deep risks. In fact, the more important something is, the more dangerous it might be. That's something I've come to sort of think in time. Okay, so there are these different possibilities and perhaps probabilities about where life could go for us as a whole, and for the world that you individually are going to live in. So you might come up with 4 different ones that are just as probable. So in terms of truth, they're all kind of evenly matched. Okay, well then there's the other criteria, beneficial. Which one which number of these are more beneficial to hold? And a pessimistic one can just do damage to your life right now. It can make you angry, it can make you scared and so on. Whereas there are hopeful ones which cause you perhaps to create a far better life, to push forward, to act with hope, to buy a house, to build a business, all the things that require a certain stability and sense that the future is a place that will reward the sacrifices that you make now. You're not going to build anything in life, and you're not going to create a better future for yourself if you don't have a basic sense that the future is a relatively stable place that will reward present sacrifice. Why sacrifice for the future if it's not going to pay you back? You have to believe that the future will pay you back to some degree that's relatively trustworthy in order for you to be motivated to sacrifice now. So, okay, and you could be wrong, and you could lose it all, but what if the future is okay, as it often has been, and you don't make it better because of the risk that it could have been worse? That's a little bit, I think it's a bit crazy, or it's a bit, I don't know if crazy is the right word, but I don't know if that's a good way to live. I get disturbed, but then I try and predicate myself on a very hopeful sense of the future, and bring myself back to that and build a life based on that. And my body shifts, you know, my nervous system changes in the light of that. My actions change, my emotions change, and so it's good to keep perhaps striving back into that mode of being, and perhaps it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. You can't control the big picture, but you can control your own life to some important degree. So focus in on that, and focus in on probabilities and the most beneficial probabilities.